needing one of these, because normally to talk to a room this size wouldn't require a microphone for me. That's going to be an interesting piece of information when you find out some of the things that have happened to me on my journey. So it wasn't always possible for me to project my voice across a full room. I have to wear it tonight because sisters downstairs can't hear unless I have the microphone. But for the moment, can everybody hear?
Yeah.
Can you hear at the back?
Yes.
Gentleman right in the corner, yes, thank you very much. You'll notice that as you were coming in, I've been going around asking people, why have you come? What do you want to know? So what I'm proposing to do is to spend about the first 5 minutes or so answering the questions that I've been asked that I can answer quickly. A group of the questions are only possible to answer by talking about my journey into Islam. So that group of questions I'll put to one side. I won't deal with them at the beginning. I'll tell you about my journey, and if my journey hasn't answered those questions, I'll be here until after the biryani and the rice this evening. So at any time later, if your question hasn't been answered by my story, please, by all means, get hold of me today. Or if you come to the masjid almost any day of the week during the day, you'll usually find me here at one of the prayers. I'm very pleased to deal with any questions that are not answered by the actual story. So, I'll deal with questions that have been given. I'll talk about the journey, and if I've got time, I'll just, since my journey ends here at the City Mosque, I'll talk just briefly about where I am now in this room with this mosque and how that fits into the story. So some very interesting questions as people came in. I think the most honest question, possibly, and when I said, well, what is it you really want to know, was, what time is the food? Somebody else said, well, what's your job? I'm actually a scientist. Originally I was a polymer scientist. That's a scientist interested in very long molecules. That's where I started off. But in the last 15 years I've become a neurochemist, because lots of the chemicals that you have in your brain actually are quite long. So that's my early experience in polymer chemistry has been very useful in the last 15 years in looking at the chemistry of the brain. Somebody said, where were you born? I was born in Stoke-on-Trent. And so when I talk about my journey, I'll start it from Stoke-on-Trent. Very interesting start here, largely born of poverty and belonging to a particularly vicious street gang. What previous religion were you? Well, my parents were Methodists, which is like non-conformist Christians, the opposite to Catholic Christians. Although I was very quickly myself became atheist. I was not very enamoured with my parents' religion. I later joined the Quakers, that's the Society of Friends, and I suppose the thing I liked about the Friends is they pray in silence, and they have no priests, they have no icons, no rituals. They simply meet to sit around quietly for an hour, and generally no one says anything. And I liked that because it meant that there were people in that circle who were Muslims, for example, because the Quaker Meeting House was just near to Fenton Street Mosque. There were people in that circle who were Jewish, There were people in that circle who were agnostic, atheists, metaphysical people, that's people believing in like nature and poetry and so on. But the Quakers didn't exclude anyone, they were very inclusive. So that was really the nearest that I got to a religious affiliation in my later life. Your previous name, and have you changed it? That was really quite interesting. I have changed my name to Zakariyam. But one of the names that I had and was given as a boy was the name Michael or Mikhail. Now that's interesting because normally, certainly in our family, people were always named after an uncle or a grandfather or a father, or there'd be some reason, why you were given a name. There is no one in my family, and I've got a cousin who's interested in doing family trees. There is not a Michael anywhere. Where did that name, Mikhail, come from to be given to me? Born of Methodist children out of a family where no one before had been called Mikhail. So that was curious. I didn't even realise that until I had the question. So thank you very much for the question there. Somebody was interested in whether or not it's been difficult not eating pork, and whether it's been difficult not drinking alcohol. It was incredibly difficult not eating pork. I'm very fond of food, and if you're talking about British food, one of the specialities about British food is combining pastry with meat. You don't find that in many other cultures. And for me, one of the best things to combine with pastry was pork meat. Pork pies, tremendous delicacy. Have I missed them? Yes, I still miss pork pie. I go into Sainsbury's and they look crisp and they smell spicy. Yeah, I could eat a pork pie. Interestingly, I never have. But is it still attractive? Yes. The other question about alcohol is even more interesting. Because not only was I interested in alcohol, first of all, I ran a campaign to prevent large breweries closing down small breweries. It's a campaign for real ale, it's called CAMRA. And I was a very active member of CAMRA. And we campaigned to stop these big breweries buying up the small ones and closing them and supplying everybody with big pasteurized tanker type beer. And that got me actually into public houses, pubs. I ran a company which actually updated the premises of public houses and made them more attractive for us places where you could take a family, where you could have a meal and you could drink good real ale. And I was also quite an expert on wine. In fact, I used to run wine tastings and competitions where you have it in glasses without the labels, you have to sip it and try and guess which country it comes from, and so on. And we did it to raise money for charity. So very much part of my life, combined particularly with my interest in food. And the answer to the question, do you miss that, is really interesting, because the answer is no. And I'm astonished, and so are all my friends and so are my family. How could someone whose life was very much organised around alcohol not miss it? And I don't know the answer to that either. It's quite a puzzle. Sixth question was, how easy did you find it to get answers to questions, queries, when you were asked things by your friends or by your family, or things occurred to you? How easy was it to get answers to your questions? The answer is it was extremely difficult. It's partly because of the countries that I was in, maybe. At the time, I was on my journey to Islam. But just for example, I had a period where for about 3 years in Preston, in which I think I probably prayed in most mosques in Preston. So you're probably talking 150 visits to mosques in Preston over the course of 3 years. I wasn't praying 5 times a day in the mosque then. And out of those 150 occasions, maybe somebody spoke to me 3 times. And trying to find out what was going on, impossible. The language was, I didn't understand. The announcements were in Urdu, or they were in Gujarati. It was extremely difficult even to feel comfortable, let alone begin to ask questions. So that was very difficult. And that has a strong bearing on my feelings about the city mosque, as you'll discover, because my journey at the moment ends here in the city mosque. Most of your other questions, like what inspired you, what reason did you give for converting, what did it feel like before and after, what was your first encounter, what made you think of embracing Islam, were there any life-changing or major events? All those questions really are covered by the journey. So that's probably the thing that I'd like to move on to next, unless there's anybody who wants to add to that list, because I didn't ask them on the way in, or they just thought of something. If you do think of something, then by all means grab me after I've talked about my journey at the end. So, I'm planning to spend about 15 minutes on my journey, which will take us to 40:50. If I finish a bit early, I've got a few minutes, I'll talk a bit about City Mosque, but certainly I will finish in time for Isha prayers. Is that acceptable to you?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm going to need some help from my friends on the front row here. So I'm really glad you guys are all here. Can we turn this over? Yeah, thank you very much. One of the things that strikes me as very curious about this idea of people on a journey to Islam, nobody ever gave me a map. They were pretty hot on the destination. They kept saying it's Jeddah or somewhere, but nobody at all ever gave me a map. So at least I'm going to try and give you a map for my journey today. But to construct it, I'm going to need some help from my friends here on the front row. If this was a map of the world, try and get where you can see it. You okay? Yeah. So let's imagine this was some kind of schematic map of the world. This bit here, where do you think that might be?
England.
England, yeah, and so the little bit on the top would be?
Scotland.
Okay. So if we've got two places, L and P, any guesses? Lancaster and Preston, yes, very good. Okay, so we've got Lancaster and Preston. And Lancaster because my journey started in Lancaster and it finished in Preston. And it's interesting that between there, we went over here. Any guesses for where over there might be? Yeah? Africa?
Let's see.
India?
Let's see. Near
Pakistan? Any more offers? Any more offers? India, Pakistan, anywhere? Yes, sir. You have no idea. Okay.
Afghanistan.
Yeah?
Afghanistan.
Afghanistan. Okay, some good guesses there. This is in fact Afghanistan. This is the northwest frontier province, as it was then called, of Pakistan. And this squiggle here is called the Khyber Pass. This line between Afghanistan and Pakistan is completely arbitrary. It was occupied by the British and they wanted to think where to draw the line. And what they did is drew it on the top of a ridge of mountains, because it's very easy then to defend it, because you put guns on the top. If anybody's coming up from that side, you can shoot down at them. If anybody's coming this side, you can shoot down. So that was the reason for dividing Afghanistan from this particular part of Pakistan at the time. But of course what it did is it actually divided villages, families, communities, and a lot of the people who live here all belong to one particular group called the Pathans. This is more interesting. Anybody any idea?
Australia.
Ah? I'm astonished that all these people knew that it was Madagascar. How do you know it's Madagascar? Ah, it's on the other side. Oh, you watched the movie? Right. Well, as part of my journey, you might be interested to know the film Madagascar. And there's Madagascar 1 and Madagascar 2 now, isn't there? Yeah. When it was originally going to be made, it wasn't going to be called Madagascar. Madagascar 1 and Madagascar 2. And when the film crew from they're called DreamWorks, I think, aren't they? Yeah. So when they arrived in Madagascar to make their film, they were looking for somebody who could speak English and who could tell them where the best places to go and the best shots and so on. And they landed in the airport at Antananarivo, and they said, "Oh, there's an English girl just down here, down there. I should go and talk to her. She's married to a Malagasy, and she's been here a while. She might be able to translate for you and help you out." That girl, by the way, was my daughter, Irene. And she did a deal with them in the end, because she was very keen to promote Madagascar, that if they would change the title of the film from what it was they proposed to Madagascar, then it would be great publicity for Madagascar, and it was all, she would make sure that she helped them in every way possible. So that's how the film Madagascar came to be called Madagascar. And she runs an orphanage in Madagascar called the Kaniabuku, and I'll be talking a bit about that. Kaniabuku, that's right. So, there are two transitions between Pakistan and Madagascar, and back again to Pakistan, and back again to Madagascar, and then finally back again to England. So those are the journeys that we're going to be going on. That's the country we will be covering as we move from this side of this. This is a kind of graph, really, and here, this is how strong was my belief in Islam. So the closer we are to the top, the stronger was my belief in Islam, and the closer we are to the bottom, the weaker was my belief in Islam. But generally it moves this way towards Islam and towards the city mosque. But I'm astonished by this. Have you seen this, you guys? I mean, come on, who produced this? It was certainly not produced by a new Muslim, I don't think. Look at this beautiful journey. Lovely, sweeping, smooth curves, yeah? You know, if you drive on a road, you love roads like this, because you can sweep around, no sharp corners, nice and comfortable, and curves around, you get nice views from one side to another. That was not my experience at all. So my journey doesn't look anything like that. In fact, what we're going to be finding is my journey going sing, sang, sing, sang, sing, sang, sing, sang, sing, sang. It's moving this way, But my belief and the challenges and difficulties are going up and down, up and down, up and down. There is no, like, great moment and from then on this lovely sweeping curve at all. So it starts in Stoke-on-Trent. I'll just move this side to keep my eye on the clock. Starts in Stoke-on-Trent. Extremely poor, extremely hungry, extremely cold. And one of the things that I do is I go off and I hitchhike around the Mediterranean. And hitchhiking, which very few people do in these days, means you just stand by the side of the road, stick your thumb out and ask people for a lift. And no money is involved, it's a very risky thing to do with hindsight, but in fact it was not uncommon when I did it. So as you go around the Mediterranean, you come across the top of North Africa. One of the things I found trying to get down there, I did have two nasty incidents on the way down. One in France, Frenchmen tried to take advantage of my situation, and another one in Italy, where someone pulled a knife on me and asked me for money. But interestingly, once I got into North Africa, I never had any trouble. And I got curious about that. And of course, I now know that all the way across the top of North Africa, all the countries were Muslim. Although I didn't realise that at the time. When I finally got to Turkey, I met a Muslim, and he said, "Are you going back to England?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Could you do me a favour?" He said, "I brought a car from England." Now, cars in those days were very rare. Nobody in my street, in my area, in my district owned a car, where I live in Stoke-on-Trent. And he had this van, a bread van. He said, "I brought it from England, but I didn't get the right paperwork, and so I'm not allowed to keep it in Turkey. Would you like to take it back to England and keep it?" He said it would get me out of a lot of trouble. So I did. And my interest in Islam at that stage and the generosity of the people who looked after me, the man who gave me the vehicle, was really quite high. One of the things it enabled me to do was to live in London, because he converted the inside of this to live in. I could live in London, and I became a student in London, which I wouldn't ordinarily be able to afford to do. And then the other thing it enabled me to do was, in the vacation in the summer, was to go to Spain. And then put it on a beach in Spain, and the food was really cheap in Spain. No heating bills, nothing. A really cheap way to get through the summer till I could come back for the university term. And the roads in France were built by Napoleon, most of them, that go north-south, so they're very straight until you get to a village and they have a little turning in them. And on my way back from Spain, driving up through one of these straight roads, driving up, and a car started to overtake me on the straight bit. I thought, he's a bit close to the bend at the other end, but he kept like alongside, he couldn't really go much faster and so on, so I started to slow down, and sure enough, as we got to the bend, there was a huge lorry coming the other way. And so he died out of the way to miss the lorry, hit the front of my car hit the tree, because all these roads have trees all the way down to protect them from the sun. And I later saw a newspaper photograph of my car, and it was literally as though you'd taken a towel and thrown it at the tree and it had wrapped around. How on earth anybody could possibly have lived? And lots of the other bits of the other story have had to be told to me since, like, at the time in France there were no ambulances, right? unless you pay for one. And so nobody sent for an ambulance because otherwise they were going to have to pay. And somebody had the bright idea, I'm told, of sending for the fire brigade. So apparently the fire brigade scooped me up and took me, but there weren't any hospitals like the NHS. So they took me to a place that was run by nuns, and it's interestingly called sisters. It's a religious order, and they took care of the sick. So they took me there, but usually what happens is, then if you're in one of these places, the family bring the family doctor to tell the nurses what to do. And they also bring food and so on. But I had no family, certainly no doctor. And apparently I was really quite badly injured. I'd broken the top of my spine, which meant that I was paralysed, I couldn't talk. I'd lost lots of pieces of bone. Some of you are probably too polite to have noticed. How many knuckles am I supposed to have? How many can you count? That's right. Nobody ever found those again. And you notice my wrist as well. Got no wrist, look. Yeah, so that's all missing. And there were loads of pieces of my bones were missing, and I was paralysed and I couldn't talk. So, at that stage, I was not feeling that good. I later learned that while I was in this hospital, which was for about 6 months, a lady came every day at lunchtime to visit me. And as I eventually gained consciousness, I remember this lady from Madame Clément. It was only a long time afterwards that I discovered she had a shop about a mile away. And she had to come by bus in her lunchtime, and she came every day in her lunchtime to sit next to my bed, occasionally brought some food and so on. Total stranger. Sheer love of a stranger. Somebody had got in touch with her, said, there's this guy, da-da-da-da, and she didn't know me, I didn't know her, and she visited me every day. The other thing that happened after I eventually got back to England, I got a postcard, well it was a photograph actually, written on the back in an envelope. And in this photograph was a photograph of a beautiful young girl with long dark hair. And on the back it said, "From the sister who loved you." And many years later I traced her down, and she apparently had been a nursing sister there, but she was a novice, a novitiate. She was only about 16, I think, and she'd just been given the order. She didn't have that much experience. And everybody apparently had told her that I was going to die. And what they asked her to do was to come and just sit by my bed and hold my hand. And apparently that's what she did. So no Medicare, no doctors, nothing. Just the love of a stranger and the love of a sister. So I eventually left by all kinds of routes. I won't go into any details at the moment. I landed back in England in a wheelchair. And as part of my rehabilitation over here, I was taught how to talk. And so technically you could say it was like drama or acting or whatever. But that turned out to be handy because one of the things I wanted to do was to get back my place at the university in London. So when I filled in the form, it has a special thing saying, what are your interests and what are your hobbies? And so I stretched a point and I said drama. It wasn't really drama, it was speech therapy. But then they had a vacancy in a play that was being mounted within the college that I was at. And so the man found on my form and he said, "Oh, you put down here drama, we'd like you to come and fill in for this person who's missing." And oh dear, because I was not really that good. To cut a long story short, the lady who was cast opposite me in the play as my fiancée was a lady called Caroline. And she became my wife. So, as a result of this, in fact, I found love. And I didn't just find love, I found love with a lady who, for example, helped to teach lots of the Muslim sisters who lived in Blade Street, near to the mosque, English, and encouraged them to come out and go shopping, and eventually encouraged them to train as teachers, because she was very concerned, she was a teacher trainer, that there was nobody in the schools who spoke the language of the Muslim children. So we were married for about 30 years, very happily. And one day she was a runner, a marathon runner. Do you know what a marathon runner is? How far is a marathon?
Is it a mile?
A bit more than a mile? 24 miles? 42 kilometres, yeah? So it's about 26 miles. So she was a marathon runner, and she was went out training with the Goldstein club here, and they all had proper signs on for running in the dark. They're running down the side of the road and so on one night, and there must have been 30 of them all running along, and a car came to overtake the line of runners, and of all the people for it to hit, it hit my wife, and she was killed immediately. Now this was a woman who was kind, loving, brilliant mother. You know, why at all? Why that night? At the inquest, by no cause, they recorded accidental death. No explanation. You can imagine that my belief in a protector, God or Allah, was not great at that point. Some of my Muslim students had heard on the radio that a runner had been killed, and they just wondered if it was my wife. But when they rang the university wouldn't tell them. So they set off from Blackpool, which is where the hospital where they worked. And eventually they got to Preston, and they set off. They knew I lived north of Preston. So they set off up the A6. Eventually they came across the site of the accident. And from there on they kept saying, well, do you know where they live? And everybody kept saying to them, just follow the light. Just follow the light. And that made a great impression on a group of Muslim students, just follow the light. What actually they meant was our house was on the top of the hill, we hadn't got any curtains, and so it was known locally as the lighthouse. So eventually they managed to find the house, apparently, although unbeknownst to me, and were invited in by lots of other people who were coming to the house on that tragic night. And they explained that they were training to be doctors here, but they were not hopeful that they could ever go back and practice in Northwest Frontier Province, because they were being taught how to be doctors who had nurses, and there were no nurses in Northwest Frontier Province, because no fathers would allow their daughters to be nurses. And in any case, they said, if we go back, we'll just be like GPs, because there's no hospital like you have here. And again, to cut a long story short, other people who were in the house at the time, a group of Quakers in particular, said to the Muslim students, we must have some good come out of this awful thing that's happened to Caroline. If we can build you a hospital in Peshawar, you know, where most of you come from, will you go back and work there? And they said yes. So the rest is history really, and you can look on the website, a hospital called Nahaki, in Pakistan. That's how it came to be set up. And it was set up just in time for when the Americans started to bomb Kabul. Even to this day, we have 3 of the finest operating theatres in the world in Nahaki Hospital. And finest people who've gone back to work there. Operating theatres all paid for with American money, and largely we spend most of the time dealing with people who are injured by American drones. Meanwhile, my daughter had gone to open an orphanage in Madagascar, the one I told you about. She got married there, and she was having a baby called Amelie. And Irene had been asthmatic. You know what asthmatic means? Yeah, what's asthmatic mean? Yeah, well, you have difficulty in breathing. From a child, she had this difficulty. But all the time she'd been in Madagascar, never had a problem. But for some reason, when she was pregnant carrying Amelie, she had an enormous asthma attack, which meant that she was very short of oxygen, which means the baby was very short of oxygen, because the baby gets the oxygen out of the blood of the mother. So the baby thought, not a good place to be, kicked for home, and so the baby came out very, very small, tiny. And I don't know whether you know, but when babies come out really too early, too small, they not even know how to suck. And here we were in the middle of Madagascar, no Medicare. The 4th poorest place in the world, in fact. And a small baby. And so we got the message, because Mum was dead, right? She'd been killed. Dad, can you help? So that's how I came to go to Madagascar. And again, to cut a long story short, one of the things that Carolyn had done when we lived in Lancaster was to help to rescue the village school, which only had 40 people in it, so they wanted to close it because it was not very economic. So they wanted to close the village school, but Caroline put her best students in the school. And the other thing she did said, we need a really good playground. They won't dare close it if we can really invest in the school. So she sent a message around to anybody who'd ever been to the school, and there were now all farmers and farmers' sons and so on. It was a very rural area. And they all arrived with their tractors, with trees and lumps of wood and whatever, and bolts and so on. They built the most magnificent playground. And to this day, if you go to Palmer School, it's still there. And it became, in fact, not just the best primary school in Lancashire, it became one of the best primary schools in the country. But this small school is what Irene had gone to. And so when we were out in Madagascar, and Irene was so poorly trying to run this orphanage, and we were struggling, having to, because the baby wouldn't suck, we had to keep painting its lips with milk. Trying to get it from Irene, so Emily would suck it. And the baby was getting, instead of getting heavier and heavier, it was getting lighter and lighter. And we knew once the baby got beyond a certain weight, it would die. On Irene's computer, she had a list of all the names of people she'd been at Palmer School with. So we just sent a message saying, Irene is in trouble, can you help? And you know, those kids who were at school with her, in this tiny little, where there are only 40 children altogether, the ones who were her age group and friends, they came from all over the world to join in the rota, feeling Emily, and to try and keep the orphanage going. They gave a really good job in Australia in one case, really good job with as a designer in London in another case. And that, Allah moves in a mysterious way His wonders to perform. And so my faith in Allah was restored. And I went back to Pakistan, and in Pakistan by now, one of the things that we had a huge earthquake, but the hospital stood, and we were able to look after 6 of the villages around there, even though we had -16 temperatures at night, no buildings standing, no windows, whatever. Nobody died in the villages that we were looking after. But in the villages, other villages that we weren't looking after, many people died. So in 6 villages at least, we were able to help them. And then shortly after that, there was a huge flood, I don't really remember. And exactly the same thing again. Nahaki Hospital again sent teams out to run the flood relief. So at this stage, my belief in Allah's will in a strange way that this awful thing that had happened to Carolyn had meant that Nahaki Hospital was in the right place to help all these people was restored. The other thing that I got from going back here was a wife. That's where I met Fakran, who's probably listening downstairs. So I got lots of good things out of that. And we went back with my wife to Madagascar. She became pregnant very quickly. The job I managed to get, which was, again, terrific news, was to work directly for the President. And so because I was working directly for the President, we were able to get a scan, because he got influence there. But when we went for the scan on Fakran's tummy, so you should have just seen like the baby, he said, first of all, are you sure you've got your dates right? Because this baby looks very big. Yeah, he said, well, I can't really tell here, I'll have to send the things away and have another look. And so they had to be sent away, these photographs. But when they came back, he said, I'm terribly sorry. It's not a baby. It's very dangerous growth. He said, but we found the baby as well. Just up in this corner, he said, you can see it. But this thing that we thought was a baby is not a baby at all. And it's growing much faster than the baby. And it will grow so fast it will kick the baby out anyway. You need to get on a plane, go back to England. You need to take the whole thing out. And to my absolute astonishment, we medevaced Fakran back to the UK, and she saw the oncologist. Do you know what an oncologist is? A doctor who specialises in cancer. Yeah. And she saw the gynecologist, who's the doctor who specialises in babies. And Fakran said, no, I'm not going to have my womb taken out to protect me from this growth. Because if I do, I'll lose the baby. And I've already decided I want this baby, because this baby's name is Danya. And she would read verses from the Quran and blow into her hands and put her hands on her stomach. And the oncologist said, you're crazy. He said, once you get to a certain stage in the pregnancy, the hormones will feed this big growth, and it will grow much more quickly. You'll lose the baby anyway, and if it spreads out of there, you'll die too. And she said, no, I'll just keep reading the Quran, blowing into it and putting it. And they said, you're crazy. Well, Danya survived. I mean, she grew as quickly as the growth in the tummy, and because it was a cesarean operation to get Danya out, As a father, I was allowed to be there. It's one of the few times you can be in an operating if it's a cesarean. And I remember now that we started off with 3 or 4 people in this small operating theatre, and clearly things were going badly. By the time I lost count, there were nearly 20 different people, with blood people and all kinds of people coming. There were flashing lights, and I feared the worst. I was there because they kept me behind a kind of sheet screen, so you can't really tell what's going on. And then I heard a sudden yes from Fiona, who's the surgeon, and above the screen I saw this blood-drenched bundle, and it was Dania. And she seemed to blink and smile, and she's never stopped smiling since. So, from the depths of my faith in the mysterious way that Allah moves was very quickly restored, and it's interesting. And Dania, in a way that history repeats itself, a few years later when we were trying to find, I always try and find a good school for your daughter, the best one. You look up and all the Ofsted things, don't you, and so on. And so we found that the best school was the one, the English Martyrs, near to the university, so that was where she was going to go. But the nearest school to us is a school called Eldon. When we looked at the Ofsted report, it was in special measures. There were less than 50% full, and of the 50% children who were actually going, they were only there about 60% of the time. Results were terrible. They were going to close the school within 6 months, if not this, and so on. There was absolutely no way was my daughter going to Eldon. But when we went to English Martyrs, they said, no, you're outside the area, you'll have to appeal. Have you been to see your local school? We said, forget it. They said, well, you'll look very silly at the appeal if you're trying to convince them that it's not the school for your daughter, and they'll ask you if you've been, you say you've never been. I said, okay, we'll go. And I made the mistake of taking Dania with me. Because we went to the school, and newly appointed was a Muslim headmistress. And Dania at that stage was quite shy, reticent. You wouldn't think so now. She was hiding behind her mum's skirt or whatever. And for reasons that we do not understand, she shot out from behind her mother's skirt, jumped into this woman, Mrs. Azra Butt's arms, and said, take me, show me around your school. And off they disappeared for 45 minutes. And when they came back, Dania announced that she was starting school on Monday. So we had no choice, really. I became a governor and various other things in the school. And again, those of you who read the Lancashire Evening Post, strange old world, isn't it? You will find that Eldon School, in the same way that Corner School, all those many years, became one of the best schools in the country, Eldon School is now one of the top 100 schools in the country. So things seem to be going really well. We got a good school, got Dania, we had Tanzila came along, and she had a great bundle of funds, and then I got colon cancer. And I was trying to get somebody in the audience to volunteer, as I was asking, have we got anybody who's about 100 kilos, and if so, would you be prepared to stand up so we can see what 100 kilos looks like? But I couldn't get anybody who was prepared to own up to. 100 kilos is pretty big, but that was my weight. And I went down to 100 kilos, which I've got a volunteer over here showing it. Was it you? Who was the child that was about 100 kilos? Was it this one? Can you just stand up? Just for a moment, just so they can see you. Well, just stand up. Just stand up, that's it. So if you can imagine the biggest guy in this room, right? Plus some, because none of them are only 300 kilos. And this is what I went down to. I had 7 consultants at one time to try and find out what was wrong with me. Eventually they found a particular kind of cancer, colon cancer, very rare, but it had killed my mother apparently, and it had killed my father very rapidly. So that was the way things were looking. I had a 5th loss, final lot of surgery, and my wife said, why don't you go to the local mosques and try and get people to pray for you? And I tried, but no. She said, tell you what, I joined a mosque which has ladies there. Why don't you go to that one? And it was Ramadan. And I came through that door, and somebody, I don't even know who it was now, said, Assalamu alaikum, brother, and what's your beautiful name? I said, Zakariyam. And he said, why are you crying? I said, would you like some dates? He said, we're just eating, and they had taken strips of cloth down here. They were all sitting around eating. And I said no, because I was embarrassed, because I knew if I sat down, I couldn't get up. I didn't have the strength to get up if I sat down. And they said, well, tell you what. And they moved the whole lot, the piece of paper, all the food, all the people, they moved it over to that side over there, to where I was sitting, so that I was included in what was going on. And they fed me on the table. So I had the nurse who loved me, the stranger who loved me, Howland who loved me, and finally I found a mosque that loved me. And the rest is history. If you come in here anytime, you'll see me praying. I do not pray from a chair anymore. Allah moves in a mysterious way. There's wonders to perform. And all those people on that journey, as it went up and down, up and down, up and down, it wasn't they who loved me. The stranger didn't know me. The sister didn't know me. But it's as though they were a channel, like like what a channel is on, like on the TV or whatever, or channel for water if you were going to irrigate something. It's like they were a channel for Allah's love. So 5 times a day at least, I pray to Allah, Allah, please make me a channel for your love.